Hello and welcome, and thanks for tuning in to this episode of our exploration of the Forest School principles. We'll be taking each of the principles in turn and looking at them in detail, and today we're looking at risk and challenge in Forest School. I'm Lily, I'm the chair of the Forest School Association, and today I'll be talking with Louise Ambrose.
Hi, I'm Louise. I'm also one of the Forest School Association's directors.
The Forest School Association is a UK charity. It's the professional body that represents forest school practitioners and supports them with resources and advice. We are the champions of quality forest school for all. There's more about the Forest School Association on our website, and you can follow links to find out more about what we do. So Forest School is an ethos-based approach rather than a series of activities, and as such, it's guided by these principles. The Forest School Association was set up to champion these principles. And in this series, we're taking a deep dive into each of these 6 principles and thinking about what they mean in practice and drawing on our experience to provoke your thinking and reflection. So let's think about the role of risk and challenge in Forest School. Lou, do you want to explain what this principle tells us?
The actual principle written down is that Forest School gives learners the opportunity to take supported risks appropriate to themselves and the environment. So that's what's written down. Just to unpick that a little bit more, in terms of risk at Forest School, we're thinking about all sorts of risks. So yes, it does include physical risk, but it also would include social risks and emotional risks as well. So we're looking at the individual holistically when we're talking about risk and challenge. The other element is it says about opportunity to take risks. So we would never force a learner beyond what they're comfortable in doing. However, we do set up the environment so that learners feel safe and secure and comfortable, so that perhaps they're more brave in an environment and might try new things because they're in a non-judgmental community where mistakes aren't really mistakes, they're just progress in learning.
When it talks about risks being appropriate to the environment and to the learner, what does that mean then?
So I take that as risk and challenge is unique to the individual. So what is a right amount of risk for one person might not be enough for another, or might be far too much for another. So the judgment around the right amount of risk is based on the unique individual and where they're at with their learning and development.
What's the role of the practitioner in that then? If the learner is deciding what level of risk is right, what's the job of the practitioner in that?
So as practitioners, a big part of what we do is observe the learners and the individuals in our care and observe them again holistically. Forest School supports holistic development, so we're looking at all elements of the child. So where are they at with their physical development? How do they coordinate themselves? What sort of activities do we see them engaging with? Are they balancing on logs? Are they climbing up trees? Are they interested in tools? But it also covers, where are they at with their emotional skills as well? How resilient to failure are they? If something doesn't work the first time, will they throw a paddy, or will they pick themselves up and try again immediately without support? So through good observation, we're able to pitch the right level of risk for that individual in our care.
In the bits of the principle that come below the headline, it talks about the risk-benefit analysis, like the risk-benefit process. Is that what you're trying to describe there, that sort of balancing act there between what comes out and the challenges that a person puts on themselves?
Absolutely. So risk is hugely beneficial. Risk and challenge are essential to healthy development, and sometimes that side of risk isn't always acknowledged perhaps by organizations or schools or even individuals. You hear these horror stories and it's all risk is bad, but actually risk is really good and really essential for individuals. It's how we learn about the world around us. It's how we test ourselves as human beings. It's how we find what we're capable of. It's also how we motivate ourselves. If something isn't risky enough, then it's boring, it's dull, we don't want to do it. So actually risk is crucial for learning of all types, and getting the right amount of risk and balancing it with the benefits of what comes from that activity or that stimulus is crucial to what we do at Forest School.
I like that description of the balancing act that you talk about there. And as you're talking about the person taking choice over what, and control over what they do, and the importance of that, does that challenge you as a practitioner then, if somebody's choosing to push themselves in a way that feels quite uncomfy for you?
It's a good question. Me personally, as a practitioner, it's the other way. But my value judgment has changed over time. So I think the first step as practitioners is we have to reflect on our own value judgments around risk, and kind of where we sit with what is a right amount of risk. And that's something that might change. I know certainly when I first started as a Forest School leader many moons ago, I perhaps wasn't so up for allowing as many risks with the groups as I do now. So for me as an individual, often people not being willing to take risks, I find sometimes more difficult to deal with than those that do. But that's only come through a lot of experience, a lot of learning, and dare I say it, a lot of mistakes along the way, but touch wood, nothing serious or life-changing. But as a Forest School leader, we have to be willing to take risks ourselves and try stuff out. And sometimes things work with individuals and sometimes they don't, but sometimes we'll only know that if we take the risk and balance up those benefits.
So in that case, and this is a question that I've asked a lot of practitioners and I'm quite interested in, would you allow a participant in your sessions to take a risk that you had no experience of yourself, or do something that's out of your experience and knowledge?
Potentially yes, but I would need some background information about that individual first. So if it's a learner that I've been working with for some time and I'd already observed their competencies in certain areas, physically, emotionally, socially, so I've got a good picture of where they sit with their skills, then yeah, I would definitely consider it. Of course, it always depends on a case-by-case basis as to what it was. And of course, we'll be doing a dynamic risk assessment in our head if it's something that we've never anticipated before. So it isn't on our existing risk assessment or a risk-benefit analysis. Yeah, I mean, I would certainly be open to it. It's very difficult without an actual example to say whether or not I would say yes or no. But that is the process of risk assessment, of course, isn't it? It is that dialogue between the benefits, the unique situation of that learner, that environment, that activity, and then the possible consequences and the likelihood of those consequences. So that's happening in our head all of the time as a Forest School leader.
You talked about dynamic risk benefit analysis or dynamic risk assessment. Talk me through that a bit more in your experience.
So yeah, so because Forest School is a play-based, learner-centered process, which is another one of the principles, of course we can't always anticipate what the learners might choose to do within a session. So we use our observations and our kind of best guesses to perhaps prepare for sessions. And so we will have documentation of risk-benefit analysis of predicted activities or predicted experiences. But sometimes kids will just suddenly decide to do something and you think, oh, I never thought of that. And of course, we still have a duty of care to make sure that we're keeping them safe in a reasonable amount and exposing them to a reasonable amount of risk. And so instead of having time beforehand to write that down, we've got to do that in our head in the moment. I personally feel that through good preparation, it makes that dynamic process a lot easier. So if I really know my site and I've got a really thorough site risk assessment, if I know the tools and the equipment that I've got to hand, and I've got proper checks, maintenance schedules and things on those, that I know that's all in good working order. If I know the learners really well, I know where their competencies are and their skills, then that helps me in the moment decide what we're doing or how we're doing it. So for example, at Forest School, I was working with a group of teenagers that were kids that basically the teachers didn't want them in the classroom, and there was a particular learner that struggled socially quite a lot. In fact, he had quite bullying behaviours and the other children were scared of him. And in the session, one of the others had been making one of those big bug hotels out of pallets, and there were bamboo canes that were stashed in the pallets for the bugs. And of course, he found one of these and proceeded to whip around the woods, lashing this bamboo cane, which inevitably made contact with a few of the other lads in the session. So of course I observed this, and my dynamic risk assessments going in my head were going kind of, well, you know, that hurts quite badly if you get whipped with bamboo. So there's a consequence there of potential harm to people. So I intervened and we had a discussion about this, and it panned out that some of the lads wanted to play with the bamboo and some of them didn't. And so through discussion, those learners were able to come up with their own control actions of their risk-benefit analysis, if you want to put it in that way, where they decided that, okay, we'll turn it into a formal stick dueling arena. So this session was taking place around the corner of a playing field in a high school, and so we made an arena out on the field where there was more space and not so much to trip over. And they created their own rules for it. So only 2 people fighting at once, so 1-on-1. There would be no headshots, no jabbing shots, no stab shots, because that could hurt badly. And each fight would have an adjudicator that would call whether or not they thought that the hits were too hard. And if you were judged as hitting too hard, then you would have points deducted. So it was a way of being able to self-regulate, or help the learners self-regulate. And so this kind of emerged and developed through them establishing their own controls. And we had several good stick fights where only people who wanted to engage in that activity engaged into that activity. And the social benefits for that particular learner, who I said was a bully and everyone was scared of, that was the first occasion that we'd ever seen him being able to play with his peers on a neutral ground. So and also for some of the others as well, you know, they don't play appropriately normal, and the amount of self-control that particular individual put in place to not hit people as hard as perhaps he would have done was absolutely phenomenal. So you could see the benefits through dynamically thinking through what's going on and putting steps in place to reduce the risk so that they could still do it, but within given parameters.
I love how whenever we talk, we end up like talking about stick fighting. What's that about? Well, as you were describing it, I was thinking how key our own ability to give permission to the children to control the risks, rather than us being the ones in control of it, how key our permissions are to others are in that example.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, there is research out there that shows that if kids are wrapped up in cotton wool and never allowed to take risks, they're much more likely to have more serious accidents once they're older or as an adult, because they've never learnt about the process of managing their own risk. So I see at Forest School, it's a brilliant opportunity to help learners understand about risk and what possible consequences might happen to them if they choose to do something else. And so it's a real opportunity to develop those skills in learners, which is going to build healthy and hopefully healthy individuals in the future. And And something I've noticed also, particularly with special educational needs groups or groups like the boys that I was describing, they're so used to the consequences of their actions being taken away from them. Because of their behaviour, they usually end up with sanctions that often are nothing to do with what they've done. You know, they've hit somebody and then they get sent to timeout or isolation or detention. And so no one's ever actually sat down and explained the consequences of their choices to them. So I find often, particularly with a learner who might be put into that kind of bracket, they don't always have full understanding of the consequences of their actions. And so taking risks, and sometimes even, dare I say it, letting them suffer minor consequences from their choices can be a really, really important learning curve for them, because they haven't been allowed to do it. You know, adults have taken that learning opportunity away from them through sanctioning them.
The real world consequences are really key to giving people feedback when they take risks. But those real world consequences, they have an impact on you as a practitioner as well. How do you act when something goes wrong in one of your sessions?
So yeah, of course it does. You know, we are judging this balancing act between the benefits and the possible harm, the possible consequences. So the way I see it, it does kind of all boil down to a value judgment as the forest school leader. So I have a unique value judgment about what I think is the right amount of risk to expose the individuals in the group to. And of course that will vary from group to group and individual to individual, and to some extent the site that I'm at. So even before I work with a group, I kind of start to think, well, where am I going to pitch this based on their age and experience and abilities? That might change, of course, as they grow in confidence and experience. That value judgment might change. So as the program goes on, you know, 6 months in, I might be exposing people to more risk than at the beginning of a program, because I know that they've learned things along the way. I think, again, I'm only talking from me personally as a practitioner. I'm not saying that this is the right way, but I have a value judgment where unless it's something that is life-changing or worse, then I'm okay with it going against the benefits. So that means, as a practitioner, I kind of expect, I'm not hoping for it, but I kind of expect that a natural consequence of being outside in a natural environment will be low-level injuries, like bruises and scratches and insect bites and all the sorts of things that you get if you're in the woods for any extended period of time. I also acknowledge, because of my value judgment, that there is also maybe a lower risk of stuff that's a bit more serious that might need external help, you know, such as cuts that need stitches or broken bones even. But I always weigh this up against the benefits. Like, so for example, if I wasn't willing, or at least acknowledge that there's a possibility that someone might break a limb, I wouldn't be able to do activities like tree climbing or rope swings or balancing on rope bridges, because all of those activities, if somebody falls off, they could potentially break a limb. So in my value judgment, I've got to weigh up that possible consequence against the benefits. If things have gone wrong, so just to put it into context, I've been a forest school leader since 2003. And in that time, I've only had 2 accidents that required sort of further help, like that needed to go to A&E. One was a broken wrist that a lad basically just fell over, just walking along. It wasn't to do with any of the activities, and he put his hand down and just cracked his wrist. And the other one was stitches from a cut with a knife, which was one of the teenagers who was doing perhaps a more complicated task than your average knife work. So weighing up those 2 injuries against all the benefits that those individuals have had, in my value judgment, is acceptable. Now, of course, when things do happen, and if accidents do happen, as forest school leaders, we need to make sure that we've got appropriate procedures and that we've been following them should authorities want to see them. So I make sure I've got my up-to-date risk assessments, my risk benefit analyses, my handbook with different procedures like tool using procedures and policies. I've got my insurance up to date should I need it, but touch wood, I've never had a claim. And I've also I've got good communication methods as well with the schools that I'm working with or with the parents of the children, so that hopefully everybody understands that risk taking is part of what we do at Forest School.
So when you're talking about all the policies and the procedures you put in place, you're a trainer as well, a Forest School trainer as well. How do you see that training being part of this process?
So yeah, so within the level 3 Forest School practitioner qualification, there is a section about risk and making sure that practitioners have appropriate policies and procedures and risk management processes. So one of the principles of Forest School is that it's run by appropriately qualified level 3 people. So and that's one of the reasons why, because the training incorporates that information. There's also the additional element that when it comes to risk, and because we were talking about accidents there, it's also important that you have an appropriate and adequate first aid qualification as well. So we recommend that people should have a first aid qualification that is at least a 16-hour course that involves outdoor elements. And there are some courses that are specific to Forest School as well, but as long as it covers being outdoors, because an outdoor environment is quite different to an indoor one if you're having to look after a casualty for an extended period of time whilst you're waiting for an ambulance, for example. So there's your Forest School training, and there's also your first aid training that you need to have in place. So something I would also mention is, as a trainer, I've experienced over the years a lot of misconceptions about health and safety and about risk. And this is a very common topic that comes up in training courses again and again. And it's also possible that managers within schools or workplaces have these misconceptions, so that the Forest School leaders are actually working under people who don't have a full understanding of risk management themselves, and so that can sometimes cause problems. So sometimes through Forest School training, it can help spread a more reasonable message about health and safety. And there does also seem to be a lot of fear out there sometimes about health and safety. It can often be used as an excuse why not to do stuff like Forest School or not to go outside. And just to reassure people that it's not just us as the Forest School Association saying that risk is a good thing. This is backed up by the powers that be. So in the UK, we've got the Health and Safety Executive, who are the government department responsible for health and safety in the workplace. And they basically got so fed up as being blamed for not taking kids outside that they created a little document that I've even got a little picture of here that you can get as a PDF from the HSE's website about tackling the health and safety myths about school trips and outdoor learning activities. And the document actually has 4 core messages that I might just read out for the benefit of people, because it's really useful to know that this is what the government's saying about risk and outdoor learning. So the first one is, well-managed school trips and outdoor activities are great for children. Children won't learn about risk if they're wrapped in cotton wool. So that's acknowledging that there are huge benefits to taking risks. The second one is, teachers should expect their schools to have procedures that encourage participation, are proportionate to the level of risk, and avoid bureaucracy. So that's about understanding the process behind assessing risk and not just getting tied up with a load of dusty paperwork that nobody looks at, kind of thing. The third one follows on from that. Those running school trips need to focus on the risks and the benefits to people, not the paperwork. So that's acknowledging about that kind of weighing up benefits against the possible harm. And the final one is accidents and mistakes may happen on school trips, but fear of prosecution has been blown out of all proportion. So I see that one as kind of clarifying about this world of litigation that everybody thinks that we live in, and that actually there has been a few cases where teachers have actually been prosecuted for an accident that's happened, and usually that's been in very particular circumstances where there has been a level of neglect or things haven't been done properly.
How much do we love the health and safety executive, by the way? That's amazing. It was interesting. I was just thinking about how long you've been involved in Forest Schools. So since 2003, you're saying that's 17, 18 years now. And have you noticed a change over that time in how society perceives children and their risk taking?
Yeah, I suppose so, a little bit, although I don't think I'm that old. But I mean, if I go back to my own childhood, you know, in the 80s and stuff, then, you know, kids used to go, I grew up in London, so, you know, we used to go out playing on the streets where there were cars, you know, be off for hours on our own. And people didn't necessarily think that was an odd thing to do. Nowadays, you do hear stories in the press about you know, kids that are playing in a tree getting arrested because somebody's complained that they're damaging the tree, or the case where a parent got reported to social services because they let their 10-year-old ride their bike to school on their own, or something like that. So yeah, I think maybe as a culture over time that things have perhaps changed in terms of people's attitude to risk. But I mean, just to put the other case forward, life is full of risk. Like every choice we make, there is an associated risk. So, okay, yeah, you let your kids out climbing a tree, they might fall out, they might break a bone. That's, you know, okay, that might happen. That's true. It might happen. However, if you don't allow your kids to go out and instead they're trapped indoors in an indoor sedentary lifestyle in front of a computer, we know from research that that can lead to childhood obesity, childhood depression, anxiety disorders, which are actually far worse than a broken bone. They are long-term chronic health conditions that eventually will kill you, or at least reduce your lifespan, compared to a little broken bone that will heal, you know, within a few months. So my value judgment comes down to actually there's less risk out there climbing a tree than there is sitting for hours in front of a computer. But often you don't hear that side of the argument, and there's an illusion that you can keep people safe, because you can't keep people safe. Stuff happens in life, but what we can do is we can help equip the children to be able to make their own choices and manage risk for themselves. So in the future, they're able to make the right choices for them and hopefully keep themselves safe, or at least within reasonable limits.
If the first time that you have to make a judgment or control your own actions is when you become an adult, right, you need to practice that skill in the real world. You can't do that theoretically, you know, you can't start that process as an adult. I was just thinking as you were talking about the quote by Lady Ellen of Hurtwood, you know, the Adventure Playground, better a broken bone than a broken spirit. I know this is a quote that we've talked about in the past. You talked about your own childhood in London, and obviously Forest School is in a very different sort of environment. So how does nature and being in nature support that risk-taking process?
Yeah, so nature is a fantastic place to expose people to appropriate amounts of risk, because nature is unique, it's dynamic, it's constantly changing. Through the seasons, things will change, different plants will come up, there'll be different weather conditions, you know, being out in the rain compared to being out in the sunshine, being out in the wind, being out in the snow. These are all opportunities for challenge and for risk taking. So nature can be a really easy place to facilitate risk taking and promoting challenge. And also, as a practitioner, it means we don't have to do much to introduce risk and challenge. You know, compare it to an indoor environment. If we want them to explore or have other opportunities, we have to introduce resources or change the displays, whereas nature does that for us. There's always something new to discover, a new opportunity that might present a new challenge to the individuals. It also emphasises the importance of forest school being long term, because different challenges will emerge in different seasons. You know, like I say, going out in the snow where it might be cold, we need to know how to dress ourselves to keep warm. You know, things might be slippery, which for little ones can mean, you know, learning how to walk or balance more on slippery surfaces, or even for adults. I am not immune to falling over in the snow, but also learning other opportunities to move, you know, to slide on snow and ice, or to make sleds. You know, there's lots of other opportunities which, if we only go out in good weather, we'd miss all those opportunities for taking risks and challenge in those different circumstances.
The idea of natural consequences that you talked about earlier, you poke a wasp nest, you might get stung. It's very cause and effect in that way, isn't it? So what you're talking about there is the natural consequences of risk taking for participants. And do you see how that changes over time as well with the participants you've been working with?
Yeah, definitely. So as children are exposed to more risk and challenge, they're learning from that all the time. So that new learning of consequences that comes in will inform their judgments the next time they do that activity, that motion, that experience. So you see progression in their learning and in their risk taking to some extent. You also notice quite a marked increase in their resilience and their emotional development, because if you take risks and you succeed, then you suddenly realize that you're capable of perhaps things that you thought before that you weren't capable of. And so that really has a knock-on effect with an individual's self-esteem, suddenly knowing that you're much more capable than perhaps you thought you were. In fact, I found a good quote from T.S. Eliot, the poet, which said, "Only those who will risk going too far can possibly find out how far is it possible to go."
Ooh, I like that. That's great.
So, you know, the idea that the only risk in life perhaps is to not take risks, because that's a given that you won't move on and develop as a human if you don't take risks. We need to take risks. And as I said at the beginning, we're talking about risks holistically at Forest School. So it might not just be those physical ones around climbing trees. It might be an emotional and social risk, you know, risking trusting a person with something, or speaking aloud in front of a group of people, are just as risky as jumping off a log or climbing a tree. And so it's important to acknowledge all risk.
And for some of those participants, just going into a woodland environment is itself a risk. It's out of their experience. It's something they don't know about. And we can never assume that children have got that experience to start with. You know, they all start in those different places. You talked at the beginning about the importance of being non-judgmental in our risk-taking culture that we're trying to create in Forest School. What does that look like in practice for you?
So yeah, for me, a non-judgmental community is a core part of Forest School for a variety of reasons, including risk, but also for those emotional benefits that Forest School develops in people. But from a risk perspective, being non-judgmental is vital for people to be able to feel like they're able to take the risks in the first place. So when we're learning, we all make mistakes that in our culture are often labelled as negative things. And I would dare to say that in our culture, perhaps people are even scared of making mistakes, and that fear of failure actually creates so much anxiety in people that they don't dare try new things because they're worried that they're going to be failing or be rubbish compared to other people at the beginning. And that's all because of the judgmental society that we live in. If we're in a non-judgmental situation, then we wouldn't have those fears and anxieties. So at Forest School, through the emotional community that we try to facilitate as a Forest School leader, we want to create a safe, an emotionally safe place where people can try things for the first time. They can choose to take a risk. And so it promotes what I'm going to call bravery. It promotes people to perhaps stretch themselves a little bit and choose to do things that perhaps in other situations where there might be fear of judgment, that they wouldn't normally do in those circumstances. So I see Forest School as a brilliant place for people to try things for the first time without having to be worried about being judged or being labelled as mistakes. After all, there isn't really such a thing as mistakes, of course. If you talk or hear inventors or creative types, entrepreneurs talking, they talk about all the times they mess up before they get to their finished product or invention. You know, I think Edison, when he was inventing the light bulb, failed 10,000 times. Like, could you imagine if he gave up after the first couple of attempts? Oh no, it never work. You know, so failure is crucial for the creative process. It's not a negative thing. We should celebrate it. So that's where I see it fitting in with Forest School and the importance of non-judgment.
I can really see how you've got to that perspective now as a really experienced practitioner, but how you talked about how it was different for you when you started out with Forest School and how that's changed. Is there any advice or support that you would give to new practitioners starting out?
Yeah, I suppose as a new practitioner, start with your own comfort zone. What I would recommend, you know, start where you're at and explore those things I mentioned earlier, like your own value judgment. Perhaps if you're working in a team, have discussions with colleagues about where do their value judgments sit in terms of the appropriate amount of risk to take. Also, try and tap into other Forest School networks. Sometimes as a Forest School leader, it can be quite isolating if you're the only Forest School leader in your school or organisation. Sometimes it can be like swimming against the tide because no one else really gets what you're talking about. So if you can tap into local networks or other Forest School leaders, within the Forest School Association, we've got local groups that you could tap into. They often have meetups that you can chat and share and ask these sorts of questions about, you know, what is your value judgment about risk.
And for me, if I'm ever in the pub with Forest School practitioners, just chatting about what accidents and near misses we've all had is, I mean, it's quite interesting and gives us that knowledge and that experience that we can build from.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, the importance of near misses that you mentioned there is crucial. And for me, certainly in my journey as a Forest School leader, the near misses have been essential to inform my value judgment about risk. And the near misses have been when I've, you know, stopped and thought, okay, that could have gone terribly wrong. Why did that happen? Unpick it, look at existing risk management processes that we've got. You know, is that sufficient? What needs changing? What needs replacing? What needs improving? So that the next time we come across a similar situation, we're in a much better place, and hopefully an accident won't happen of a serious nature. So for me, although I've mentioned I've only had 2 accidents at Forest School that required a trip to A&E, I have had many more near misses where things could have been, you know, nasty, but those have been learning experiences. And I think as a Forest School leader, we need to also be non-judgmental to ourselves to some extent and see that mistakes happen. You know, oh God, that rope snapped on that rope swing, shit. You know, and we've got to learn from that rather than beating ourselves up about it and trying to ignore it or bury it, going, oh, that didn't really happen. Because a key part of being a forest school practitioner is being reflective on your practice, because that's how we become better at what we're doing. You know, we're all on a journey for learning and developing as a practitioner.
So out of interest then, what are the highest risk things when you've gone through your own risk management process? What comes out top?
I would have to say foraging activities if we're doing it, or anything that's working at height, like tree climbing or rope structures, because both of those have the potential to end in death if you get that wrong. So you know, if you don't know what you're doing with foraging, and of course do bear in mind that as soon as we give a learner the idea that you can pick something from the wild and eat it, we've suddenly dramatically increased the likelihood that they might go away and do that when they're not with us at forest school. So even the idea of foraging, even something like blackberry picking is technically foraging, which for young children, do they know the difference between a blackberry and a deadly nightshade berry, for example? You know, they might not. So as soon as we introduce that idea, we've increased the likelihood that they might put something in their mouth. And of course, there are species out there that could have serious life-changing consequences or even worse. So for me, foraging is something that I really have careful control actions around. That's not to say I don't do it, of course, because there are the huge benefits of foraging and learning about the plants, but it's something you need to be really careful with, I think. And then working at height speaks for itself. Of course, if you fall from a great height, you're in trouble, and you're looking at potential broken necks, head injuries, all sorts of things that could be very, very serious. So I would say, without a doubt, those two things are the highest things on my risk assessment. All of the other activities, usually if there is an accident, it's not a life-changing accident. You know, they're minor things like cuts, or even if you're doing fire, you might burn your hands a little bit, but it's unlikely to be a very serious burn. You know, that it's usually treatable with first aid. So yeah, that's what my risk assessments look like.
So when you talk about risk assessments, I mean, a lot of people I talk to, a lot of people I know, when you say, oh, we need to do risk assessments, think of them as being quite a boring, dull process. How do you feel about risk assessments?
I love them. So for me as a practitioner, it's going through that risk management process, that risk assessment process, that actually empowers me to be able to do the things that I want to do with the learners. So it's knowing that process, knowing my value judgment, making decisions about things as we go through that systematically in a risk assessment, that actually makes me feel confident that, yeah, we can go out and climb a tree, or we can go out and pick blackberries without me worrying, you know, about the possible harm that could come from it. It also gives me a sense of confidence to talk to other people about why we're doing it and the benefits about why we're doing it, and, you know, how we've come to those decisions and those control actions that we might put in place. So for me, doing your risk management stuff is completely empowering and completely necessary to be able to do the stuff that we want to do. If we don't have that in place, or we're not good at it, then we really should question whether we should be doing those high risk things with the learners. So love risk assessments.
We need to set up a fan club for risk assessments, right? Because it is that like you described, that process of using your calm, rational brain, so you're not having to do that in the moment when there's a group of kids out there doing stuff and people asking what they should be doing. Yeah, I can really see that. It's been really interesting talking to you, Lou, about your own experience of risk taking. What's your background that's brought you to this point?
Thank you. Well, I've been a forest school practitioner since 2003, as I said, and I've been a forest school trainer since 2007. So I've got a range of experience of both delivering Forest School and then helping other people deliver Forest School, and I've worked with all different age groups from little early years children all the way through to adults. So again, I've had a range of different contexts to explore risk through. I'd say perhaps my personal interest in risk comes from my own life experience as well. So as far as I'm aware, I've always been a risk-taking child when I was younger. At least that's what my mum tells me. So it's something that I've always found useful in my life, and even as an adult, there's been occasions where I've taken risks where the outcome to an outside person might have seemed like a negative, where I have caused myself injuries, but actually those experiences have been very rich in terms of the learning that's come through them and life lessons that would have never occurred had I have not taken that risk and actually not become injured. So for me personally, risk has been a big part of my life in terms of the learning and growth that it has facilitated.
So it's been really useful to think about risk and challenge and its role in Forest School, and how that merging of action and awareness for the practitioner and for the participant is really key to the developmental process that goes on there. We've looked at risk and challenge separate from the other principles, although they've been woven in there. And it's worth bearing in mind that this is just one part of what makes up Forest School. And if you're interested in looking at the rest of the explorations of the different principles, there'll be links here. And also there'll be links to the Forest School Association and our website. And if you're interested in joining us as a member, we'd really encourage you to do that in order to carry on these conversations and share in our experiences. Thanks ever so much to Lou. It's been really great talking to you again. And yeah, look forward to our next conversation.